unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. We have come to the very end of our sixth season of Grand Tamasha, and we have been thinking over the last couple of weeks how we might wrap things up before taking our normal holiday break. Many of our listeners who started listening to us way back when will recall that when we began this podcast in February of 2019, it was a way of providing sort of weekly commentary on the 2019 Indian general elections, which were held in May. Those elections came and went, but we kept going week after week, month after month. In many ways, therefore, I am a sort of accidental podcast host. But in addition to being a podcast host, I'm also a podcast consumer. Two of my favorite podcasts on India are The Seen and the Unseen with Amit Varma and Ideas of India with Shruti Rajagopalan. So I thought, what better way to end our sixth season than with a amazing grand tamasha mashup of two of my favorite podcasts and podcast hosts. Amit and Shruti join me today via the wonders of the internet. Guys, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Milan. Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. It's such a joy to be here. I feel like it's not a podcast. I'm just sitting and chilling with friends. It's beautiful.
So I wanted to create a sitting and chilling with friends vibe. It is only 11:08 a.m. here, so I don't have my glass of wine or my scotch handy, but I have my herbal tea. So that will have to do. What I thought we could do is sort of have just a back and forth about a couple of topics today. Based around sort of three questions, right? The first one is, it's been about a dozen years since the economist Lant Pritchett, which many of our listeners will know, famously called India not a failing or a failed state, but a flailing one. And I thought that I might ask you guys if you think this term still applies to India in the year 2021. Number two, we are now embarking on, I guess, the 8th year of the Modi government. A lot has happened in the intervening years. Are we finally at a place where we can characterize what the so-called Modi economic doctrine is? And last but not least, I've been podcasting for almost 3 years. I think, Shruti, you've been at it since about August 2020. Amit, of course, is the kind of granddaddy of all podcast hosts. I think you've done like 250 episodes now. What, if anything, have we sort of learned about the art and science of podcasting in our individual journeys? So I thought we could talk about these three things. Let's start with the flailing state. So, I had to write a piece recently on the Indian state and went back in time. There have been all of these different characterizations of the state, right? So there was Gunnar Myrdal's idea of India as a soft state. There were the Rudolphs, Suzanne and Lloyd Rudolphs, who are the sort of political science pioneers who talked about the paradox of India's sort of weak, strong state. But I think the most popular characterization of the Indian state, at least in the post-91 era, has been Lant's idea of India as a flailing state, where basically, just to summarize for those who aren't familiar with this argument, India is a country in which sort of its apex institutions, aka the head, appear robust, but local governance, aka the limbs, are sort of mired in crisis, right? And I think that the reason this shorthand caught on so well is because it is in sync with what we see every day, right? You can hold elections for 1 billion people, you can do a census, you can do a Mars mission, but you can't do the most basic things like, providing safe drinking water, health and education, and so on and so forth. This argument is more than a dozen years old. And Shruti, maybe I could start with you. I'm wondering, as someone who's thought a lot about law and economics, the Indian state, do you think that Lant's characterization still fits the India we know and love today?
I think so. And I think the question Lant's characterization fits, but the more important thing about it is that Lant sort of opened up a new line of questioning on why is India the flailing state, right? Why is it that we are able to hold elections for 1 billion people or conduct a massive vaccination drive, which despite its various problems has still been more successful than most other places in the world, and so on and so forth. But we can't get the garbage picked up, right? So that's one part of it. The answer usually comes down to state capacity. Most people have been talking about how the union government was always relatively more capable over 70 years of, say, very high degree of centralization. First, because of socialist planning, and then continuity of institutions that were strengthened during the first 3-4 decades of socialist planning has managed to create those capacities to perform these tasks, but local governments haven't. And so this one simple way of looking at the problem is we simply haven't empowered local governments, right? Our constitutional structure is really out of whack. We have not had any kind of sensible form of fiscal federalism and devolution. So, no matter how good the union government can't get the garbage picked up. It simply can't be done in a country of this size and this scale. So, which means you do need to have municipal corporations, urban local bodies, panchayati raj institutions that are actually functioning at capacity. So, that's one way to think about, land's question. The other way to think about it, and this is something that my colleague Alex Tabrock and I have been working on, is, I don't flail when I'm carrying 10 pounds, right? But if you gave me 70 pounds to carry, I am going to flail and I am going to collapse, right? So there's also a question of load bearing, which determines if a state is flailing or not, right? So if a government didn't attempt a number of things, you wouldn't even know that it is failing at doing those things. And here we are predominantly talking about the regulatory state in India, which is just so vast and overwhelming. And a lot of this is, uh, remnants of a socialist past, right? Is trying to control every tiny aspect of the economy, which needed to be criminalized because socialism and controls begged that kind of enforcement, and which has sort of continued into present times. And plus, the post 1991 liberalized world requires its own kinds of regulatory state, right? So when these two interact with each other, you get this giant amount of regulation, which the government simply does not have the ability to enforce, and therefore it flails, right? So if the first part of the answer was that we need to build capacity at certain levels of government, the second part of the answer is we need to reduce the load of many branches and levels of government. And the way I would think about reducing the load as an economist is what can be left to decentralized action, right? Whether it's markets or civil society or some other kind of action that will do the trick, versus what are the functions that the state absolutely must perform that cannot be left to anyone outside the state. Right. So that's the other way I approach the problem.
So Amit, let me ask you to weigh in, because there have been a number of pieces in the last couple of years. I've written a couple myself, but many others have as well, which said that we have this flailing state idea with a rather functional head and rather dysfunctional limbs. But in fact, if you look at the past decade or so, the head itself appears to be relatively wobbly, right? So a range of elite institutions, the Election Commission of India, the IAS, some would say the RBI, the investigative agencies, right? These are all kind of core federal institutions, have seen their reputations tainted or tarnished in some significant way. Do you buy that argument? How do you see the top and the bottom sort of fitting together?
Firstly, I think, Lant's paper is an absolute classic. I just reread it again and I was just stunned by how good it is, and everyone should read it. And I buy what you just said, that the head is also kind of all over the place, and that's partly by design. It's partly that, when our founders, so to say, back in 47 to 50, that period, sat down, wrote the constitution, designed the state, in a manner of speaking, this extreme centralization was written into it for rational reasons, because the country was kind of falling apart, and these guys are sitting in a room in Delhi where there are riots all over the country, there's fighting. Your urge is to centralize, to build a state that is strong at the center, and to take a lot of power there. So that's one aspect of it. But to kind of get back to talking about the flailing state, like, my thought really on it is that a lot of this analysis and a lot of these the academic work that's going on here is very useful. But I'd also the part that worries me about the Indian state is not that it is flailing, but that it is in a sense invisible or unseen. And let me kind of explain what I mean by that. One, I think the term flailing, if I'm to get semantic, might not be is a perfect one in the way that Land described it. But anyone who's flailing has self-awareness. It implies self-awareness. You know you're flailing, right? Maybe you can't help it, but you know you're flailing. In this case, I'm not sure that's true. But the deeper sense in which I mean that the state is invisible is that most of us, most citizens, kind of take it for granted that the state is too big, it is too intrusive, it is a parasite, and we notice none of these. If you use these words in the public domain, people will be like, what are you talking about? And at this moment, I'd like to, in a podcast on policy, I'd like to bring in a very short poem by the poet W.S. Merwin, and I'll explain why I'm doing that. uh, Separation by W.S. Merwin. Your absence has gone through me like thread through a needle. Everything I do is stitched with this color. So it's a lovely poem about loss and a very brief one, but everything that happens in India is stitched with the color of the state. And it's not even a color, it's kind of a dulling filter. Everything is less sharper, and we don't kind of realize that. And that's what worries me. And this is not an orthogonal point, it's a pertinent point, because the point is, if you want to reform the flailing state in ways that people like Shruti and Alex have pointed out, in ways in which you have pointed out in your brilliant first book, and all the writing that you do, I think that change will have to come from the demand end of the political marketplace, not the supply end. You can't hope to talk to politicians or policymakers or bureaucrats and say, hey, we are flailing, this is why we are flailing, this is what we can do, we need to decentralize, blah blah blah. I think that there needs to be this larger consciousness of the nature of our state. And sadly, we kind of take it for granted. Indians are fatalistic about it. Last year in April, when COVID broke, I in fact wrote this column in the Times of India about how we are confronted with two disasters. And one, of course, is a pandemic, and that's the immediate one. But the other is an ongoing one of the Indian state. And a lot of the things which are consequences of the state being the way it is, if those were to happen because of a natural disaster, the whole world would be rushing to help us. It would be a moral emergency. But we take them for granted. Like, 3,000 children die in India every day from starvation. Even today in 2021, 1 in 4 Indian children are malnourished. And I could go on and on. You guys know this. It's a dismal state. It's an ongoing disaster. And at the heart of it is really this flailing state. And part of the solution has to be to make this flailing visible, as it were.
So you guys both sort of touched upon this issue of centralization. And Shruti, I guess I would come back to you and just ask, clearly there has not been enough investment in devolution and decentralization. Even what exists on paper is not met with what is there in practice, right? But to what extent is that a central government issue as opposed to the states, right? Because when I look around, it really seems to be an issue that faces leaders in state capitals, right, who have jealously guarded their own prerogatives because they want to retain control, as opposed to send things down to local municipal councils or panchayats or districts and so on. Is that a fair characterization?
It is. I think the problem is both. I do agree with you that not enough states are devolving whatever fiscal resources they do have. I think that's a really big problem. You have a few states like maybe Kerala and Karnataka who actually end up devolving a fair bit. Most states, especially the northern Hindi belt, right, the states which are the most dense with the biggest municipal problems today, they're simply not devolving enough. Having said that, uh, the rules are still set at the top. And I mean this in the following sense. Sorry if this is going to become a geeky public finance thing for a moment, right?
We expect nothing less from you, Shruti.
The union government still does not devolve enough, right? The union government still controls the purse strings through the Finance Commission recommendations, of course. But there was we came down from the 90% level to the 60% level and things like that. But now we're once again slowly creeping up. That's one part of the problem. But the other part of the problem is we have never truly had a federal system where state governments are responsible for balancing their own budgets and will not be bailed out by the union government or the RBI, right? There's a difference between decentralization and federalism. Federalism is you are in charge of your own power structure. You are not a branch or a subsidiary of another power structure. We have decentralized very well in India. We haven't federalized very well in India. I think that would be my characterization. And this is most seen in public finance, right? So, okay, we're going to devolve further, but devolution is not going to do the trick. You've got to tell state governments that they actually need to live within their means. And now have some kind of public campaign which says, look, we gave 90% or 75% or whatever is the appropriate level of resources to the state government, so now this is entirely their problem. And I do believe that the union government's very good at marketing campaigns, right? We've seen that they're pretty good at communication with a large number of people. They're not interested in devolving in that way. They're not interested in removing the public finance element of control from state governments, because only their ability to bail out is going to help them get political favors when they need it in the Rajya Sabha, and when they need it when they elect the president, and when they need it for a host of other things that we're talking about. So unless we solve and make ourselves truly federal, right? Unless any system, we're a little bit in trouble. So I don't think state governments can carry all the blame. Yes, they can do a lot more, but they're responding to the incentives that they've been given, and their incentives are not to balance their books. It is to live beyond the means and know that when there is a shortfall in Panchayati Raj institutions and urban local bodies, the union government will announce some yojana that directly devolves some plan expenditure at, to build roads or to build toilets, which go straight to those institutions. And that's really the way we've been running the country for the last, 7 decades.
So, Amit, if you look around and you ask yourself the question, we see a lot of worrying trends on the democracy front, right? I think we're all familiar with the rise in majoritarianism, curbs on dissent, free expression, centralization of power. What are the safety valves that one has in a society like India? And the one that comes to mind most often is the states, right? You do have this federal setup, and so the states, in some sense, can act as a counterforce. And so just to pick up on Shruti's point, are they doing so, right? Because in some sense, you could make, I think, two arguments, right? The first is that, well, in fact, the Modi model at the center is really just a scaling up of a model that has existed at the state level, that he's now said, instead of doing for 60 million Gujaratis, I'm going to do it for 1.3 billion Indians, right? But you could say the same about Mamta or Kejriwal or YSR or Jagan, excuse me. That's one. But the second argument is that when the chips are down, take Article 370, for instance, where you basically demote a state, split it into two, and say, well, if you behave well enough, we'll maybe re-promote you to a state. Many other political leaders didn't mount much of an effective campaign against that, right? Kejriwal again comes to mind, and now look what happened to him, right? His own authorities of his government were stripped away. So how do you think about whether we're at a point where states can actually do more to push back against the central tyranny, as it were?
They can, but they don't. But I'll go back to how you started, and I'll say that there are three safety valves which I think are quite useful. One is the stupidity of politicians, and I can elaborate on that in another sense, but maybe I don't need to. The other is the incompetence of the state. It is, after all, flailing. And the third is the inertia of our society. So all this, I think, are decent safety valves which afford a level of protection purely because, how bad can things get when, all these factors are together. But as far as politics is concerned, I just read this very interesting essay by Keshava Guha. I think it was in the print. I forget where it was. Maybe you can link it from your show notes, where he points out something really interesting, where he points out that, if you look at how the BJP does politically in general elections, not state elections, forget that, how they did in the last two general elections, and you look at all the states, in the overwhelming majority of the states where it did well, it was up against the Congress. And the Congress, as we know, is a flailing party. It's actually worse than that. There is no head and the rest of it is flailing for all practical purposes. But in the states where there was a multi-party system, the BJP had a much, much tougher time. So therefore, while right now there is the appearance that, there's one dominant party and the state is all powerful, and isn't that a recipe for disaster? I would say that not necessarily. A week is a long time in politics. Strange things happen. So I'd, hold that out. As far as, the opposition. One trend that really dismays me is that politicians like Arvind Kejriwal and even the Congress have sort of seemed to have come to the conclusion that you cannot mess with the Hindu vote, that the Hindu vote is all powerful, which is basically conceding victory to Amit Shah and to what he did in consolidating all those different identity groups, and saying that we can't mess with the Hindu vote. So whatever else we do, we'll fight them on other margins. We will not battle with the Hindu vote. Like for Kejriwal, this is very explicit. Kejriwal's thinking is, I will fight on governance. I will say I will give you better schools, better healthcare, and I am Hindu. I will worship. I will do all of those things. So those guys won't get pissed off at me. That's the conclusion they seem to have made, and I think that's a wrong conclusion. I think that's a wrong conclusion because I keep invoking Whitman's quote on my show about how everyone contains multitudes, and I believe that is true of all voters as well. So there may be a part of you which believes in this Hindutva thing, however we define it, but there are other parts which want other things, which want schools, which want better opportunities for their kids, or a more open society, whatever, all of those things. And I think what I'd like to see is parties creatively engage with ways to figure out how to appeal to other aspects of people's personality. As far as Hindutva is concerned, honestly, I'll tell you something. One, you can't out Hindutva the BJP, and two, I feel that even for the BJP, this is a tiger they can't control. It's out of control. This is something I think at some level Vajpayee and Advani realized, and I have gone down some Hindutva rabbit holes in social media, and they think Modi is too moderate. To them, Modi is like Nehru. He's just not doing enough. They think Adityanath is too moderate. You won't believe the kind of shit that there is, and which is also a sign of hope, because I remember chatting with a guest of mine, Raghu Sanjay Lal Jaitley, who writes a brilliant newsletter with Pranay Kotasane, and we were chatting about you know what can we do about the dominance of the BJP. And his point, he alluded to the German theorist Carl Schmitt, who said that, look, in politics you need an other. So actually, if the other has disappeared from because of the BJP's dominance, if that is the case, then the other will come from within, and they'll splinter and splinter and splinter. And what we see in these modern polarized times is that there is an incentive for anybody within any group or echo chamber to go to the extremes. So that's another interesting shift to watch out for, that as that is something that in the long term will make the BJP weaker. In the short term, it could make them more extreme.
So before we move on to the economy, Shruti, maybe I could, if I might, just inject a bit of contrarianism here into this discussion. And my jumping off point is an essay that Devesh Kapoor wrote in the Journal of Economic Perspectives called "Why Does the Indian State Both Fail and Succeed?" And this, in some sense, maybe is the successor to Lant's 2009 piece. But one of the things Devesh says in that article, and it comes at the very end, I think it's like in the last page, is that to him, one of the most intriguing contradictions embedded in the Indian state is actually the marked improvement of frontline implementation of policy, despite of the fact that there are growing questions about the capacity at the macro level, right? And so he talks about all that has happened over the past, decade: expansion in bank accounts, toilet construction, LPG cylinders, direct benefits transfers via, mobile money and Aadhaar, and so on and so forth. Many of these have been popularized as central government schemes. They all have Pradhan Mantri affixed to their names, but in fact, when push comes to shove, they are all implemented down at the local level, right? As most schemes in India have to be, given the diversity of the country. Do you think there's anything to this argument that, in fact, we are seeing some sort of transformation, that the limbs are maybe becoming a bit more functional and a bit more together than we tend to give them credit for?
I don't disagree with what Devesh has said in terms of facts, right? I mean, I do agree that a lot of the implementation has to happen at the ground level. Panchayati Raj institutions are constantly vetting the beneficiaries of the Narega scheme or, the BPL scheme. And a lot of the entitlements, right, the welfare entitlements in India are flowing through the layer of government right at the bottom. So I don't disagree with that characterization. Having said that, I don't think that automatically, to me, suggests strengthening of the limbs. I think it means we got bionic limbs, and the second I take the battery out at the top, it will stop, right? To me, strengthening of the limbs would suggest that the limbs have revenue raising capacity, right? That their electoral mandate and their fiscal mandate are actually really tightly linked with one another. That the same people who are voting for them are also paying the local taxes. And therefore, if people wish to have better garbage, disposal mechanisms, that's what happens. If people actually wish for, LPG schemes, then that is what is given, right? But right now, what we see is a streamlining of a top down approach, which I understand is better than a not streamlined top down approach, which is what we had in the 80s and 90s, well into the 2000s. This idea that 70 to 80% of what is being given by the union and state governments never reaches the bottom and the beneficiary, right? So that's one part. uh, on another part, I will agree a little bit with Devesh in that, the Panchayati Raj and urban local bodies, this is just 25, 27 years old. They've only had 5 cycles of election. In the scheme of democratic empowerment, that's like a hot minute. It takes a long time for these kinds of institutions and processes to firm up. Sometimes it takes hundreds of years, and even then they're not robust. So I do have a lot of hope. I do have hope that the way Devesh suggests that, if they're good at giving LPG, to the beneficiaries and they're streamlining it well, then the beneficiaries will require more funds being given to these governments, and they're more willing to come up and pay taxes or user fees. And that way, there's a bottom up strengthening process. So I am hopeful in that direction. But I don't think just because they streamlined a process automatically means that they are suddenly empowered, in a meaningful way that suggests a lot of federalism or fiscal federalism.
Hey, Grand Tamasha listeners, thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grand Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. This is maybe a natural segue to our second topic on the economy. We've sort of been dancing around this. Amit has noted on Twitter that this is the 5th anniversary of demonetization. We've just celebrated. Celebrated.
Happy Demonetization Day, people. I hope your pockets are empty today too.
which in doing so, Amit re-upped his Times of India piece, and we'll link to that in the show notes, about how this was the sort of biggest confiscation of private property in Indian history, and maybe in any history. At the same time, we're entering the 8th year of the Modi government. And I think, one of the questions that's sitting here in Washington, as Shruti and I do, we often get asked, right, is, how do you think about what the Modi economic doctrine is, right? Like, what are the components? Have we been able to distill what the elements are, right? Because if you look at any individual policy decision, you'll see some market-friendly ones, you'll see some extremely protectionist ones, you'll see some where the intent is right, but the implementation is bad, and so on and so forth. So, Amit, maybe I could start with you. I mean, if you were posed this question, what do we know about what Modi's economic worldview is for the country? We know that he wants to create a $5 trillion economy in 2024, right? But that's not really a strategy. What do we know about how he thinks India can achieve that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, when you talk about Modi's economic doctrine, the truth is that his economic doctrine has nothing to do with economics, and therefore it's not an economic doctrine. It's not even a doctrine. It's all over the place. So let me elaborate. See, before you have a doctrine, you have to have an understanding of whatever the subject is. Now, here's the thing, that in for any political party that comes to power, they're basically playing two games, right? and you can divide it up, but there are two broad games they're playing. The first game is how do you win elections, right? And that that's a selection effect. If you've come to power, it by default you've played that game really well. Modi is a master of it. Amit Shah is a master of it. They're geniuses of playing that particular game. The other game is a game of governance, to which these guys came in as complete beginners. So now, when you speak of economic doctrine, it's part of the second game. It's not part of the first game, which is all about narratives and how do you get votes and all of that. So, one, this is a separate game where you're beginning from a position of zero. Now, where is Modi actually?
Could I just interject 1 second
Sure,
on that point
sure.
before we get to the next one, which is that the claim to fame that Modi made in 2013 and 2014 was, in fact, that he had a
From
governance
Gujarat,
track
yeah.
record, right? So, in addition to the Hindu hardliner image, which was one element, the second was basically, if you elect me to power, I will do what I did in my state and I'll scale it up.
That's actually part of the first game, not the second game, because that's a narrative. And so let me explain. A friend of mine knew the prime minister very well in his Gujarat days, and she told me about this story from 2007, 2008, where the 6 or 7 of them, friends of Modi, were sitting in his house, and he started telling them a story about when he was a kid, his mother had fever once, and she was feeling extremely hot. So she wanted the fan put on, and he went to put the fan on, and he realized there's no electricity. And as Modi related the story, apparently he started crying. And my friends, and sincerely crying, obviously. And my friend's point in telling me the story was that Modi's view of the world is experiential. So, for example, when he became chief minister of Gujarat, one of the things he said, I will do is I will get power to every village in Gujarat. It's an experiential view. He understands the importance of electricity because he's experienced it. He understands the importance of roads and infrastructure because he experiences it. But when you're governing at a wider scale, there's a lot else you have to understand that is counterintuitive, that is not so easy. Spontaneous order, the positive sumness of things, the way economies work, all of that, it's deeply complicated. Now the point is, how do you learn all of that? One way is, you understand the world better by joining dots. You get dots by reading. It's not his fault. He wasn't born to privilege. He didn't read enough. He didn't have that basic knowledge. So that's fine. One cannot blame him for that. But then there is a question of attitude, that what you do is you bring experts into the room when you're in power, and you learn from them, and you hear as many opposing views, and that's what people who learn to govern well do. And he's never done that, in the sense that he's somehow defensively, because he himself is not that well read, again for no fault of his own, has developed this reflexive distaste of experts, and therefore he thinks of everything in this folksy kind of way. And that's one strand. I'll come to another strand a moment later, but that's one strand we need to understand about Modi, that his thinking about the world is very simplistic because he's not listening to the experts. And therefore, if you look at something like demonetization, which I'd call the largest assault on property rights in human history, and I think I must have written more pieces on it than anyone. And Shruti was a guest on my podcast also a couple of times when we discussed that. And but what I always say about that is an example of Hanlon's razor, which is, do not attribute to malice what can be adequately explained by stupidity. And I don't mean this in a harsh way, but in the sense that Modi simply did not have any economic understanding. His finance minister Arun Jaitley did not know about demonetization before it was announced. This is a fact. Any experts who were consulted back in the past, weeks or months before the thing, experts at the RBI said this is a nonsensical idea. He just kind of went ahead with it because, in his folksy way, his thing was that, I want to be seen as pro poor. The poor hate the rich are corrupt. They store black money in cash. We're going to hit cash. But the point is, he probably hadn't bought anything from a store in 20 years, so he didn't realize that a 1,000 rupee note was no longer just something people use for storage. It was an actual medium of exchange, and that went to hell. So this is sort of, so when you talk of his economic doctrine, there is everything that they do for narratives. And if their basic understanding isn't good, and we've been lucky in the past to have people like Manmohan and Chidambaram, whose understanding obviously was solid, they were actual experts. But in this case, we didn't have that. He didn't even consult experts or give them the respect they should have. And even when they get a doctrine wrong, it is based on different kinds of narratives. And like the recent example of the farm bills, there is much to like about the farm bills. And this was a rare example where they got the economics right and the politics wrong, where the politics was disastrous. You do not try to implement this in a democracy the way they did. It's a strike against federalism. And something like the farm laws, with all the differing local conditions in the state, should really have been decided by the states and a little more locally than he did. And there was no attempt at persuasion. The protesters, who have a right to protest in a democracy, were painted as anti-nationals and all of that, and the whole thing was a complete mess. So this is a rare example where, even if they happened to kind of, a good policy came out of there, oddly the politics around it was dismal. And normally the politics is the thing they get right, and the economics is the thing that they get wrong. And the final point I'd like to make is that, look, in India, all parties, when it comes to economic policy or public policy, are basically the same. We are a country that believes in coercion and everything. So our economic policy is left leaning, and when it comes to our social attitudes towards free speech or can you eat what you want, they are extreme right wing. So coercion and everything, it's a libertarian's nightmare.
Shruti, do you agree with that? I mean, the fact that there is no discernible doctrine that we can say says, okay, this kind of encapsulates what these guys are trying to do when it comes to getting India's economy back on track.
I actually disagree with Amit. I think there is a discernible doctrine. It's the economics of control. Okay. And this is fundamentally, they never quite understood. I mean, the parts where I agree with Amit is they don't understand the market system, right? That decentralized decision making can actually be a positive sum game, that people who are pursuing their own self interest can actually lead to socially beneficial outcomes when they are guided in the right institutional structure by a price system and so on and so forth. So I think that part, Amit and I are absolutely in agreement. Uh, the part where I disagree is I think even something like the farm laws, right, or tells us. I don't think it's a victory of economics and a failure of politics. I think it's a failure of both. I don't think of Modi as a good politician. Modi is good at winning votes. Okay, good politicians are those who are good at building consensus. Okay, Manmohan Singh was a good politician, contrary to popular opinion. Narsimha Rao was an outstanding politician, right? We have had very good politicians who are able to build consensus in a highly fractionalized society where there are lots of different interests and where you're constantly facing transitional gains traps and people need to be compensated and brought on board and so on and so forth. What seemed like some of the wins of the Modi government were actually wins of Arun Jaitley, whether it's GST and bringing about that kind of consensus, whether it's trying to implement, the bankruptcy code and things like that. These are not the Modi Shah wins. And they are not the Modi Shah wins simply because I characterize them as what Adam Smith called the man of system. Right? Adam Smith talked about, the man of system who treats everyone in society as a piece, a pawn in a game of chess, right? Who can be moved around without their volition, and no unintended consequences will come about because, after all, they are just pawns on a chessboard, right? They're not really going to say anything or go rogue or anything like that. So I think that's a really big part of the problem. The idea that I can get state chief ministers and the RBI and the Supreme Court, and I can just move all these things on the chessboard because I am the guy, right? I'm the person in power, and my office affords me this ability. So this goes back to your point of, India is very centripetal, and not only is it centripetal in terms of the vertical structure of separation of powers and the horizontal structure of separation of powers, it's highly centralized in the executive, right? And this is the kind of system that you get. So I genuinely don't think there is a lack of doctrine. I think it's a continuation of the old doctrine. We believe in the economics of control. We like capital controls. It used to be FERA, now it's FCRA. Tell me the difference. In real terms, right? One affects businessmen and tech industry, and one affects the non-profit industry. But other than that, there's really not much difference in the way we approach currency controls and capital controls. So it's a long tradition of which Modi is just gotten better at this because he has a bigger mandate and he knows how to do this. Uh, When it comes to things like demonetization, I think there's a second aspect to Modi. And I think Amit is right that there is this element of his lived experience because he fundamentally doesn't understand how markets work. But I think it's a little bit more than that also. If you observe a lot of Modi's uh, sort of big plans or, big sort of even the well-intentioned grandstanding, right, in economic policy terms, it's not about building public goods and infrastructure that will help a decentralized system come up with better outcomes, right? It is actually transferring private entitlements because Modi doesn't trust the market system or a decentralized system to do the same. And he doesn't trust it because he doesn't understand it, right? So if you put any economist in the room, right? I mean, Amit and I might be particularly on the libertarian side. Most people, they will tell you that the government needs to provide public goods, right? And quasi public goods. So public goods are those that are non-excludable, non-rival. Quasi public goods, we're going to throw in things like, schools and, places, quasi public goods like roads or, highways, which are prone to congestion. All of those things, we're going to toss that in a bundle. And the government should be providing that. And everything else, market and civil society do a pretty good job and let them take care of it. Right? On this, you need some kind of a regulatory state so that people don't commit fraud upon the system. You know the usual argument. If you don't trust the decentralized state to actually allocate either efficiently or justly, now you're going to try and control all of that. So if you go back to Nehru thought the decentralized state allocates efficiently, but it doesn't allocate justly. So we need to have these massive interventions, right? Modi is at a point where I don't know if he knows the difference between allocating efficiently versus allocating justly, but I don't think that he thinks that the decentralized system can do either very well, which means we need to do everything. And given that the prime minister's office can't exactly build roads and sewage systems and garbage disposal and good public goods right at the grassroots level, what am I going to do? I'm going to drive up private entitlements because that's where I can see that the women are hurting the most because they don't get pipe drinking water, right? Or like the children are hurting the most because they don't have access to toilets and there's a lot of open defecation and so on. So I think there is a doctrine. It is a mistrust of decentralized systems, and it is the economics of control, which always translates into the politics of control.
Amit, looks like you wanted to come in here for a sec.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in to say I agree with everything she said, which might sound odd because she just said I disagree with Amit on one point. But what I would say is what you're classifying as his doctrine, this economics of control, is kind of a default state running through all of these years. So when I said he didn't have a doctrine, what I meant was he doesn't have anything separate from this default. And I'll just make the brief observation that is kind of ironic that he keeps ranting against Nehru and the family and all of that. But his top-down thinking is identical to Nehru, and his authoritarian streak is identical to Indira Gandhi. So it's all very funny. I mean, he is a true heir to Indira Gandhi. Not the bloodline heirs, as it were.
So as we approach minute 49 in this conversation or something like that, at risk of turning into an episode of The Seen and the Unseen, because we could be here for many, many hours talking. This has been a lot of fun. Let me go to our third and final topic, because it's something that all three of us, I think, have thought a little bit about, which is this issue of podcasting, right? And I wanted us to discuss this because I just read and reread Amit's very thoughtful blog post on his sort of philosophy of podcasting, and we'll link to that in the show notes. And just to read a snippet, which could be summarized, is why are Amit Varma's podcast so damn long? Amit writes, I often get asked, why are episodes of The Seen and the Unseen so long? Who's got time to listen to 4-hour episodes? Why don't I make 1-hour episodes, or break these up into half-hour chunks, or at least put time codes? Amit, here is your chance to definitively put to rest this question.
No, first of all, I want to say that I'm not making a normative or a value judgment on how long a podcast should be. I myself have made pilots for 5-minute shows and all of that. But to talk about how this podcast evolved, like when it started 5 years ago, I thought people have short attention spans and you need to keep it brief. You need to hook them in 15 seconds. Being longer than 20 minutes is a mistake, all of that. But then I realized this medium is incredibly different for the following reasons. 3 reasons, really. One, people listen. The use cases when people listen are fairly unique in the sense people listen while commuting, working out, or doing errands. In each of those cases, they're a captive audience, have chosen to be a captive audience. And like, when I'm watching a YouTube video, I can, go to another of the 500 tabs I have open. I can turn my head and talk to someone. I can pick up my smartphone. But if you're out jogging and you're listening to something, you're captive. Reason number two, people listen to podcasts at higher speeds, like double speed or more. The brain can comprehend language at 500 words a minute, whereas we speak at about 150 to 200. And which is why people also get distracted, because spare attentional capacity. So people find it really easy to listen at higher speeds, going one step at a time and so on. And reason number three, which I feel is the most important, is that people have a hunger for depth. There aren't people with short attention spans and long attention spans. There are people with both. It depends on the context. If I'm hanging off a local train and I've got a tabloid newspaper in my hand, I have a short attention span. I could stop reading at any moment. But in a weekend, I might sit down with a cup of coffee and really want to immerse myself in something. And my attention span is different. People have a hunger for depth. They're not getting it for two reasons. One, traditional media doesn't give it to them because the way the incentives are aligned in various different ways. So, especially in India, you have, if you look at the state of our news television or whatever, and they're all subjects which are worthy of 4 hour podcasts on their own, everybody is basically a mile wide and an inch deep. And people want to go a little deeper. And the second thing is they don't often have the time to go deep in traditional ways. Everybody wants to read more. I haven't met a single person who says, I read enough. Everyone wants to read more, but in our busy lives, where is the time? And one way of consuming tons of knowledge is just by listening. When you're commuting, when you're working out, doing all of that, you could listen to an audiobook or a podcast. So, what I kind of realized, and for example, just to give an example, I had done an episode on education with Karthik Muralidharan, which was about 3 hours, 15 minutes, and Karthik had it transcribed, and that came to 40,000 words. And where on earth, in 1.5 hours of listening at double speed, are you going to get 40,000 words of input of focused conversation, in an accessible way? So, and so for all the podcasts I listen to, I think that that's just a great service and make me smarter. And it's not coming at the cost of my reading time or anything. It's like when I'm doing things where I couldn't be reading a book anyway, like running in the park, which I should do more of. And what I also realized is that there's something about the form, that if I'm doing a half an hour podcast, my immersion in the content is a certain kind of emotion. If I'm doing a 10-minute podcast, I don't even need to read the book. I'll have three stock questions, and if the guest goes on too long, I'll have to interrupt her, and so on and so forth. But on my podcast, and that keeps a conversation at a very shallow level. When hosts keep interrupting, like none of us do, we are good hosts, but many hosts of interview podcasts or shows will just keep interrupting all the time. That doesn't allow the guest to sink into whatever the narrative is, and the conversation stays at a shallow level. What I love is just letting them talk. And what I especially love to do these days in the first hour or 90 minutes of my podcast is talk about the guest's personal life. Where did you grow up? What were your early influences? What kind of books did you read? What kind of kid you were? This allows them to kind of settle into that. This personalizes them for the listener. The listener might tune into the podcast saying, here is an expert on flailing states. And it's a kind of a boring subject, and you might already have an ideological propensity to believe one thing over the other, and that colors what you're listening to. But when you personalize the guest, when they begin to see the guest as someone who is a friend, and the intimate nature of a conversation does that. So often listeners tell me that I felt like I was sitting in your living room listening to a conversation. You personalize them. The guests also go past the normal prepared sound bites, and they open up and all of that. And it's just wonderful. Where because I do this, I have a 4 hour format, 5 hour format, I listen. I sit back and listen. Stephen Covey once said, we don't listen to understand, we listen to respond. I think that's a problem. I think it's important to sit back, get your ego out of the equation, where you're not trying to show how smart you are, where you're not looking for gotcha moments, where you're not trying to impose your point of view, but just listen, go in different interesting directions. And I think if you do this more and more, like I definitely think over the last 5 years, I've become a little more patient and a little more open to ideas and to just listening to people, and even gained a genuine interest in people. So for personal reasons, this format is really dear to me, and long will it continue for the seen and the unseen. But otherwise, I'm not at all making a normative judgment on formats per se. I think the world of podcasts is as wide as, say, the world of books or the world of talking. And, different things serve different purposes, and more power to all of us.
So, Shruti, maybe I can turn to you because you joined this crazy world of podcasting, I think, during the pandemic. I'd love to hear your reflections. Sort of what have you learned in the year, 18 months that you've been doing this?
So, first of all, I'm Amit's podcast baby, right? So I think my podcast parent deserves a little bit of credit and all of the blame.
So are
Okay.
there like podcast cousins and siblings and like
Yeah.
crazy stepchildren and
No,
all
I
that?
know my podcast siblings because Amit has launched like so many podcasts, and he's done that in two ways, right? I mean, one, he's launched a million podcasts simply by virtue of cracking open the market, right? I mean, it's through Amit's podcast becoming really big that we know that there is a hunger and a thirst and a demand for really wonky, nerdy stuff, and there's people out there and they will tune in, right? So, in one sense, he's kind of launched lots of podcasts. In another sense, he's launched a lot of podcasts in that even now, my claim to fame when people say, I loved your podcast, I first think they're talking about mine. Now I know better. They mean the episode of
That
Amit's
time you
podcast.
were on Amit's
And I've been
podcast.
on Amit's podcast like over a dozen times. So, it's just accumulated. So I'm known more for being a guest on his podcast than being a host on mine. So in that sense, he's launched, many of our podcast careers. Um, I started recording just before the pandemic and we stopped immediately because I thought that, there's some magic of face-to-face recording which will be lost on Zoom. So we just stopped. And then we saw that this pandemic is just going on and on and on. And we can't just like, take a break from work. So we sort of slowly reintroduced it. And thankfully, everyone's been so kind and generous and helpful. And I have a stellar podcast team at Mercatus. Then, so, we were actually able to put this together during the pandemic. For me, the motivations were a little bit different. When I first spoke to Amit about, I'm thinking about doing this, Amit's number one advice was be yourself. Don't think about, oh, this is what is popular, long podcasts or short podcasts, or it needs to be general or it needs to be wonky. Just do what you want to do. And there is an audience out there that is there for you, right? And that's to him, that was the most freeing aspect of the podcast format. And he sort of nudged me in that direction. And what I realized was I don't like talking to 90% of people in the world, right? That might actually be an underestimate at this point. I like talking to very specific people. I like reading very specific things. I live in a sort of academic bubble. And the people I really want to have like 90-minute, 100-minute conversations are not people I meet when I bump in on the street while walking my dogs. The people who've written these incredible books and these incredible papers. And I have the kind of privilege that affords me access to these people. And if I invite them, they will actually show up for a chat. So, so that kind of what drove this. Um, and I still, the other day someone accused me that my podcast is almost like studying a lot from a professor's class and showing up for office hours, like, the enthusiastic grad student who shows up for office hours and asks a list of questions. And I was like, actually, that's a pretty good characterization. I know you didn't mean it as a compliment, but that kind of sums up my approach to life that, I like reading this stuff. I like talking about things that are not obvious from the text itself, that, you get a lot of these insights when you talk to the person and they frame things a little bit differently. And that's sort of, been the direction in which I've gone. But I think finally the approach is I am talking to the me 20 years ago in Delhi University when there was no one doing law and economics and there were very few people doing interdisciplinary work. And I frankly had no one to talk to. I was quite a lonely sort of person. I mean, I had a lot of friends and, I spoke to a lot of people, but I was very lonely in that I had very little research direction and guidance of what were the possibilities when I was 19, 20 years old. And I thought one nice thing that the podcast format can do is right now, if you open journals or if you open Twitter, it looks like everything is development economics. Or if you open the, development economics journal, it looks like everything is randomized control trials, right? But academic literature on India is incredibly rich and diverse and interdisciplinary. And maybe what people just need is to hear from these scholars and talk about their research and their journeys in their own voice and be like, oh, I think the same way. I'm trying to understand the same problem. Maybe an academic approach or a policy career is also for me, right? So I think at the end of the day, I'm doing this sort of to fill some void of the 19-year-old me that remained unfulfilled.
And I just want to interject here and say that, this is probably the first conversation where Shruti and I have spoken for an hour and none of us has asked a question. So, on behalf of both of us, the question
Thank
for
you.
Milan and a question for Milan, and I'm sure all your listeners want to know, Milan, tell us about your podcast journey and what have you learned, and how do you look at podcasts differently today as you did when you first started in season one?
Thank you for asking that. I mean, as I said at the beginning of the show, Amit and Shruti, I was really sort of, don't want to say arm twisted into this, but some colleagues in our communications department said, why don't you try doing this? We have an election coming up, and there's a lot of interest around the world, and you could sort of, use this to sort of shed light in addition to all of the other work you're doing on the election. And I thought, okay, that's good. I can do it for 6 months, and I have to say that sort of something, a light bulb sort of went on, right? I think reacting to two different things. The first is that, since the year 2000, give or take, India's graph in the kind of policy world has been steadily rising, right? There's just all kinds of interest in India from various quarters, from the diaspora, from the media, from civil society, from the private sector, from government. But there has been an undersupply of policy relevant work that reaches these people. And so a huge hunger, but an undersupply, not because that work isn't out there, but it hasn't really come to their attention, right? And this is for good reason. I mean, if you step back and you think about Indian politics, and you have RJD and BJD and DMK and ADMK, I mean, it is very complicated, right? So I think a lot of people shrink from sort of embracing that complexity. That's the first. The second is, I work at a think tank. It's a foreign affairs think tank. Like all good think tanks, we do a lot of events. I may get in trouble with my employer for saying this, but I think 95% of think tank events are really bad. I don't think that that they're moderated particularly well. I don't think that there's a diversity of viewpoints necessarily. I think they always start late and run late. They're just frankly not delivering what I think they can and should. And this has now become my default, where I can kind of run the event like I want to run it and ask the questions that I want to ask, but I'm typically in the audience with my hand and no one calls on me. And that sort of is an empowering thing. Right. So I think I kind of had those two realizations. Right. And I think what we realized over time, at least I realized, is that I think there is a sweet spot for us anyway of people who are interested in India, right? At some level, they've kind of self-selected into that group, but there's a wide diversity. There's people who, like the three of us, live and breathe and drink it, and then there's some people who may travel there once a year. They'll read the New York Times, but they haven't really gone below the surface level, right? And so it's, how do you come up with a podcast that sort of can bring all of those people together, right? And I have to say, just as a sort of fan, I've learned a lot from the two of you about sort of how to bring people in, how to set things up, how to really draw them out. And like Shruti, I think it's been a huge. I mean, it does feel very self-indulgent, right? Because, like, of course, you're producing this for others, but there's like a degree of self-edification also, right? And doing this for your own kind of learning and expanding your horizons, and it allows you, and I'm sure you both feel this way, to talk to people that you never would have gotten the chance to, right? Uh, Novelists and politicians and journalists and people who have written these amazing books, right? This has now become sort of a standard thing that they all do in the course of shilling for their own work, right? But it's great to be the beneficiary of that. So without going on for too long, maybe I'll just ask you both sort of one final thing before we wrap up. I mean, Amit, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the books that are in the works, which some of our listeners might not know about. That the Seen and the Unseen is not just a audio phenomenon, but is soon going to be a written one. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I've sort of, I'm going a little slow in curating it, but I cut a deal with a publisher where We are publishing an anthology of the best conversations of the seen and the unseen across, 4 volumes: politics, history, economics and policy, and society and culture. So I'm just curating bits from all the many, many conversations I've had and kind of classifying them into these 4 volumes, and you'll find your own names in those volumes, of course, I'm sure. And yeah, so that's what it is in the works. And otherwise, there are other projects which I just, people think I'm really productive because I bring the podcast every week. I have a writing course where I give classes every week. But otherwise, especially through the pandemic, I've just been really unproductive, not managed to get any work done, including write the books I want to write. So my dream project is really a sort of a non-fiction book where, or not even, it's sort of a book of sort of my thoughts about my political philosophy and my ethical philosophy coming together, where I kind of ask these 2 questions. And one question is that, how should we live our lives at a personal ethical level? And the other question is, how should state and society be organized in relation to each other? And to me, both of my answers to both of these kind of dovetail into the same thing, which has to do with a respect for consent and a distrust of coercion. So I just want to, write a brief book of ideas, fleshing those thoughts out and talking about that. So that it's something I've been thinking about for many years. I could probably sit down and write it in 3 months, but I've never kind of gotten down to it. There's always this sort of, people often say that perfection is the enemy of production, and I keep telling my writing students that, if there's a choice between getting it done and getting it right, and you have to get it done, that's the only way to eventually get it right. So that's a lesson for myself. And with the new year soon upon us, that's kind of my resolution, that I want to get that done. Yeah.
As they say in academia, right? The best dissertation is a finished dissertation.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for that.
Shruti, what about you? Sort of, what's next? How do you see this sort of evolving? I mean, one question I often ask myself, kind of, as I'm thinking about this, is like, how long do I keep doing this? Right? I mean, it's fun. I like it. But like, does something eventually run its course? How do you think about sort of where you take this next?
When marginal benefit is below marginal cost, right? So this is you're never going to get an answer that is too far from that from me. No, I mean, I'm enjoying doing the podcast. I think it's been really nice. Some of the other things I have gotten out of it is also when you deeply engage with a scholar about their work, you also form a relationship on other margins, right? This is going to be embarrassing, but I guess this is my new set of friends in a sense, right? So now, I mean, we've had people on the podcast who I didn't know before the podcast who have actually become, collaborators and friends, and who send me recipes or postcards, or, I send them book recommend. So, it's created something. The podcast also has this other element. I put out a transcript. I don't turn them into volumes of books like you, Amit. Show off. No, we put out a complete link transcript for each and every podcast. The idea was it tends to be quite dense and academic, and people want to look up, the names of papers and books that are being mentioned in passing. And when scholars talk to each other, they just kind of say, "Oh, that paper by so and so," and we never give the full citation. So that's kind of how it started. But it's been really nice for me to know that the podcast transcripts have made it into syllabi at many schools, right? So not the entire podcast, I assume. I assume it's individual episodes here and there. One of someone I know was in Chris Blackman's class at Chicago's Harris School, and just took a snapshot of the syllabus and sent it to me. And the podcast was listed in one of the recommended readings. The transcript was listed in the recommended reading. And this has been, a number of people have sent me like little snippets like that it's made it to various syllabi. So that to me is super encouraging, that this is that it's not just a form where people are listening, it's also reading, and it's helping them read more and get into particular literatures and particular scholars. So that kind of makes me happy. In terms of my own project, I'm one of those weird people who became very productive during the pandemic. I guess this is what happens to introverts, right? You shut the whole world out and you're suddenly like, wow, there's all this time and energy.
This is great. I don't have to talk to anyone else.
Exactly. So that turned out well, but also there was so much pandemic related stuff that we were doing. So, we did a bunch of stuff
Right.
for COVID. We launched a project this year called the 1991 Project, which, we've been doing series of essays and papers and things like that, which released through our newsletter. I believe some of the original reformers are going to record their oral histories with us, which would be really, really nice, to put out that kind of, made that launch, many more scholarly articles and thought processes about how reforms are done in India. And that's kind of the idea of going to them and recording their oral histories. I wrote lots of papers this year. I guess that's the other nice thing. The deep disappointment is that my book got stalled, mainly because of travel to India and the archives not being digitized and, just the lack of access. And a big chunk of the book is historical. This is about property rights in India and, eminent domain and land acquisition and those sorts of ideas. So a lot of it is not digital. A lot of it is not easily accessible. It requires me or someone else to actually sit in the archives and dig up some of this stuff. So the book project got stalled, which I really hope will revive in the new year. But everything else has been, business as usual. I give more lectures now because I guess the transaction cost and actual cost of, I gave a talk today morning to some excellent students at, the Gokhale Institute of Economics and Politics in Pune. And normally it's such a pain in the ass to, even if I'm visiting India, to bring me from, Delhi or Bombay or somewhere else to Pune just to give a talk. And here you just, you send a Zoom link and it works out. So I've actually been able to reach more people in India during the pandemic to talk about a lot of the papers and, things we've been doing on Mercatus, which has been super fun. And the last thing I do is emergent ventures, which is one of the great joys of my life, more recently. This is a philanthropic program at the Mercatus Center that Tyler Cowan started. And I direct the India chapter or the India grants portion of emergent ventures, and we support moonshot ideas. So that has been hugely rewarding through COVID and otherwise. We recently had an emergent ventures sort of meetup after the pandemic for the first time in a long time. And just how incredibly smart and ambitious these young people are. And, sort of the scale of the ambition and the kinds of problems they're solving. I'm going to tackle air pollution. This is not something listen, even in papers that are trying to tackle air pollution, you'll hear a very narrow format. This paper attempts to define this in this really narrow particular way. And this young 20-something young man called Angad Daryani, who's like, I've created a new device and we're going to create hyper-local solutions to tackle clean air, and we're not going to wait for the government to get its act together. And to hear something like that even is just so rewarding. So I do emergent ventures, which I think right now is one of the most fun parts of my job, which is overall a lot of fun.
Well, Shruti, Amit, we will link to all of these exciting ideas on the show page, but I just want to thank you both for taking the time. We've all managed to be on each other's shows, I think, but I thought it might be fun to sort of bring us all together. And I was thinking about what the mashup would be called, the scene ideas of Tamasha. I think that's all thrown together. But thanks for everything that you guys do. Thanks for your continuing to do those things, and look forward to doing this again when we have more to chat about. But for now, it's been a pleasure talking to both of you.
Thanks, Milan.
Thank you for having us here.
Grand Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com, India's fastest growing podcasting platform. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. Helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we reference on this week's episode, visit our website, grandtamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Caroline Duckworth. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Cliff Jayapranada is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.